Good morning. My name is Ali Sadre, and I have the pleasure of introducing this morning's session. This year, we're opening our virtual convention with a panel discussion on racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to recognize Casey Whitesett as our DEI subcommittee chair, whom you're going to hear from a bit later in the program. The SEAOC board is committed to see our association as a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. It's time to take responsibility for the lack of diversity in our industry. It's important to recognize the privilege that we have and the power dynamics that work in our favor. We should not seek comfort from those who are marginalized by the dynamics that we have enjoyed for so long. Instead, we should recognize that we play an important role in moving this organization towards equality through our education, training, recruitment, and hiring practices. For years, we've been making the case that diversity fuels innovation and insight. The data is already there. Ethnically diverse companies perform 33% higher than the norm. Forbes' best workplaces for diversity enjoy 24% higher revenue growth. But how many Fortune 500 CEOs are persons of color? The answer is 3. So, what about our workplaces? Let's talk about some real numbers. If you wanted our workplaces to reflect the larger population, then in each of our offices, the employee base should be about 13% Black and 18% Hispanic. That is what America looks like. Let's be clear, diversity and inclusion are not the same thing. Diversity is about numbers. Inclusion is about impact. Employers can mandate diversity, but they have to cultivate inclusion. The question is how? With that, I'll turn it over to our moderator and our panelists who will tell us more about our DEI panel discussion and some of the proposed solutions. Here's Emily Guglielmo, the NCSEA president. Emily?
Thanks, Ali. My name is Emily Guglielmo, and I'm privileged to serve as this year's SEAOC president and as a member of the SEAOC Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board Committee. Thank you all for your active participation in this important discussion today. We strongly encourage you to contribute questions for the panelists via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Also, this session is being recorded. I would like to first recognize the contributions from many individuals for today's session. Our 4 member organizations have assumed leadership roles in the development of today's program. From San Diego, Llewellyn Benitez. From Southern, Lorena Arce. From Central, Anna Tikatz. And from Northern, Priscilla Wynn and Natalie C. And I'd like to thank Raphael Sibeli and Janelle Maffei, my partners in preparing this session today. Janelle's behind-the-scenes efforts have ensured this event will run smoothly, and Raphael will be concluding our event today with some key takeaways from the discussion and commitments moving forward. And most importantly, I want to thank our panelists, Gwyneth Sear, Ruben Martinez, Henry Burton, Thuy Fontelera, and Mohammed Musa, for their eloquence, courage, passion, and commitment to sharing their stories and messages. Today, SEAOC is taking the critical first step in listening to our members' experiences and messages. While some consider these topics outside the sphere of structural engineering, we believe SEAOC has a critical role to play in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion within our profession. We applaud our panelists for their willingness to engage in difficult discussions because we recognize that true progress is on the other side of such discussions. While words matter and are a critical first step, it is the actions that affect change. Your SEAOC board commits to taking these discussions and implementing strategic initiatives to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion within our association and the structural engineering profession. I would like to now ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Ruben.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ruben Martinez, president of Martinez Moore Engineers, a Texas-based engineering consulting firm. I'm a structural engineer by education and by almost 25 years of experience, although my firm offers structural and civil engineering as well as parking consulting. Any story about myself has to begin with my parents. From them, there were two constants that I always knew. And these were clarity of purpose from my father and unconditional love from my mother. In the vernacular of current times, my parents would have been called illegal aliens. I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Both of my sisters and 2 of my brothers would have been called dreamers. My next older brother and myself would have been called anchor babies. There's a part of me that kind of always wished that I was also a dreamer, to have that much more in common with the rest of my family. But as is the case with many families like ours, our parents were courageous enough to dream of a better life for our family and acted upon it. When my father came to the United States, he worked agriculture and landscaping. In his work, he visited universities and was so impressed by the beautiful campuses he visited. He always told us that as he worked there, he dreamed that one day his children would attend universities such as those. He was always very clear. Do your work and study, study, study. He did backbreaking manual labor, and he said he did what he did so we wouldn't have to. With my mother, I always knew where I stood in her mind, and it was always front and center. I grew up in an English optional Mexican neighborhood on the south side of Chicago that was literally across the railroad tracks from a black neighborhood. My entire upbringing was in this setting. To call our upbringing modest is to overstate our means, but I always had what I needed. I attended a magnet public school in Chicago that was about 60 to 65% Black, about 20% Hispanic, 10% Asian, and about 10% white. I first learned about affirmative action at my high school, where the school did everything it possibly could to get white kids to attend school. And in retrospect, I'm very thankful for that. As I was graduating high school, I naively thought the whole world was like this. But when I got to Rice University in Houston, Texas, the script could not have been more flipped. There were far fewer students of color than I had ever dreamed could possibly be the case. I knew that I had to adjust, and I did, but I still gravitated to what I was more comfortable with. And to this day, my best and closest friends from both high school and college are people of color. Most of my closest friends are Black. That is why this past year has been so difficult for me. And I do not pretend for one second that this has been the only bad year. I've known my friends for a very long time, some of them almost 35 years. I consider some of them my brothers. I know that their fears, their pains, and their concerns for themselves and their kids are real. So being in the AEC industry, I know that there is much to be done. Our industry does not reflect our country, much less the rest of the world. I've joined a DEI council with a partner firm of mine, Walter P. Moore, where Raphael works. I've engaged in various discussions with my employees and others that I work with, because I feel the time for silence is past. I look forward to finding solutions to make our industry more diverse, equitable, and inclusive.
My name is Gwen Sear. I'm a principal at Janney Elsner Associates, WJE. I've been with them for over 26 years now. I'm in my 27th year. Joined straight out of college, out of grad school. I'm transgender. I transitioned in 2012 from male to female. And I have additional questions coming up that I'll describe that in some detail, but suffice it to say that I was deeply closeted for basically my entire adult life until 2011, 2012. And so it was a big change for me, for my career, to transition basically 18 years into my career. Mohammed, you want to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mohammed Musa, and I'm a senior undergraduate student at the University of California, San Diego. I'm currently pursuing a Bachelor's of Science in Structural Engineering with a specialization in civil structures. I'm also currently the Vice President External for the National Society of Black Engineers, otherwise known as NSBE. My interest in structural engineering started when I was taking classes in community college, and I realized that I was, good at math, so I kind of stuck with the STEM route. And during my time in community college, I would take the bus to school every day, and I noticed a particular construction site on my way every day, and I would see the progression day by day, and I realized like I enjoy watching the progression. I want to be a part of something so monumental and be making an impact on such a big scale. So that's kind of why I see myself being mesmerized by structural engineering, construction management, this type of field. And I am also really big on diversity and inclusion, which is why I became the Vice President External for NSBE. I want to present a lot of opportunities to underrepresented students, and hopefully one of my goals is to continually inspire the youth to pursue a field in STEM to increase the representation of individuals in this field. And I also want to be a good role model for students who don't have access to people that look like themselves in structural engineering.
Hi, everyone. I'm Thuy Fontelera. I'm the founding principal for Element Structural Engineers. So I came to America at the age of 4 as a Vietnam War refugee. Life has its many challenges. Growing up in America, especially as being the oldest of a first-generation immigrant family, my earliest memory of my life was the feeling of being hungry. This feeling never left me. It's what keeps me grounded, no matter how successful I may feel. I remember being a junior in high school and discovering that I wanted to be an architect. I went home, told my parents that I want to be an architect. My mom asked me, "Why do you want to do a man's job?" She was so worried about it and persuaded me to change my career choice. On the other hand, my dad said, "If Mulan can do it, my daughter can do it." Now, mind you, this is many years before Disney discovered Mulan. I overcame many obstacles that would tell me I would not succeed, and yet I am here. I first started my business with this notion that I needed a white male partner to succeed. This was my own unconscious bias. I'm glad to say that that's not the case. I've built this firm from a one-person shop to a diverse team of 9, and I'm not done yet. So I'm here today to share my perspective on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how important it is for our community to start this discussion and take action to create a more diversified, equitable, and inclusive future. I look forward to the conversation. Henry, you're up next, I believe.
Yes, sorry about that. My name is Henry Burton. I am an associate professor of structural engineering at UCLA. So I'm going to skip a lot of the details of my personal story, but I would like to highlight that since I arrived in this country from Trinidad and Tobago in 1997, there have been 4 sets of experiences that have shaped who I am today as a structural engineer. The first is my undergraduate experience at Morgan State University. And for those that are unfamiliar, Morgan State is an HBCU, an historically Black college or university located in Baltimore, Maryland. For some context, it's one of a small number of universities that produce a significant number of Black scientists and engineers in the US. The second pivotal experience is the time I spent at Stanford. That's where I got my PhD. My advisor was Greg Dearline, who you may recognize as the opening speaker for the conference. The third major experience is the 6 years I spent at Degenkolb, and the last is in my current profession at UCLA. Now, in the interest of time, again, I'm not going to go into the details of any of those experiences, but I'm happy to discuss them with anyone on an individual basis. For the rest of my time, I'm going to focus specifically on the lack of representation of Black structural engineers in California and in the US as a whole. Now, in doing so, it doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge the other aspects of diversity. It's just that, one, I don't really hear anyone else speaking up about this specific issue. And when it comes to diversity, obviously it's one that I have personal experience with. So I don't think anyone would disagree about the lack of representation of Black structural engineers. I don't have any data to back this up, but if we were to use the percentage of Black SEs as a benchmark, I suspect 0.5% would be a very generous estimate. Just to put that in perspective, the last time I checked, there were roughly 7,000 SEs in California. 0.5% would put that number at about 350. Again, for context, as Ali mentioned earlier, Black Americans make up about 13% of the US population. Now, there's another way we can look at this. Black Americans make up about 4% of all scientists and engineers in the US. And that's actually a statistic taken from the National Science Foundation. Now, with a number like that, I would say Blacks are underrepresented in science and engineering more broadly. Whereas within structural engineering, I will go as far as to say that we're almost completely excluded. I heard Raphael Sabelli use the term dimensions of diversity, and it tickled my academic sensibilities. Well, if you consider Black structural engineers making up one of those dimensions, we're pretty much still at the origin. Now, my personal viewpoint is that this is a problem, not a minor issue that if we can address, it would be nice, but a serious problem. And so the first key point I'd like to leave you with is a question. Do we as a profession have the collective will to view this as a problem? And I think the answer to that question is largely going to determine whether there's going to be any measurable change in the foreseeable future. Now, if we're willing to agree that the lack of Black structural engineers is a problem, the question is, what do we do about it? And obviously, we're not going to solve that in this panel, and I know there are efforts related to increasing diversity going on at the MO, state, and national level. But the one thing I'd like to say is, we as a profession need to both literally and figuratively be willing to take one step closer to the Black community. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we need to be willing, open, and intentional about inviting Black people to the spaces where structural engineering is practiced. And I'm not just talking about mentoring. Mentoring is great. I've been both a mentor and a mentee, but there's nothing like getting first-hand exposure to the practice of structural engineering. Here's a more specific idea. Consider offering internships, not just to students that have already made up their minds about being a structural engineer. How about you consider that freshman student who's trying to figure out which area of civil engineering they're going to go into, and maybe their only exposure to structural engineering is an intro class that they took during their first semester. And again, I know there are efforts within the profession to develop specific diversity programs, but my second and main point here is that if we really want things to change, those efforts have to be targeted. Now, to end, I'd like to make the point that my experience as an observer is that millennials and Gen Z place a lot of value on diversity. And I'm going to make the prediction that in the future, diversity is going to play an increasing role in which professions attract the best and brightest individuals. And that's all I have for right now.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you to all of our panelists for your introductions. As we stated, we'd like this to be a discussion with our members on the webinar here today. So to that end, we're going to try and use a few polls to get some feedback from you guys. I'd like to launch our first poll here and ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how diverse is the office in which you work? 1 being not at all diverse and 10 being extremely diverse. So I'll give you a few minutes here to take this poll, and it is an anonymous poll, so no opportunity to track your results. All right, it looks like the results are finalizing. I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results with the group here. But it looks like our most common answer was about a 3 in terms of how diverse is our office, with the range of answers coming in somewhere between about a 3 and a 7. So thank you. That's really, really great feedback for both this discussion here today and also for SEAOC's DEI committee moving forward. I'd like to now move into a few questions with our panelists. So I'm going to start with you, Mohammed. I'd like to ask you a question a little bit more about your experience with NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers. How has your involvement helped you in the pursuit of your career or in your own personal development?
That's a good question. So NSBE has personally connected me with a lot of people who are in engineering, and that I wouldn't have had access to otherwise. I remember when I first joined NSBE, any question that I had, I could ask the president, Kyle, who always had a good answer. And if he didn't have a good answer for me at the moment, he would point me in a direction to someone that would have that answer for me. Through NSBE, I have been able to attend the national convention in Detroit in 2019. And it was there that I met the first Black structural engineer. And I was quite shocked. I didn't know that there would be other Black structural engineers, thinking that, you know, I was like the first of its kind. I feel like that was a really strong connection that I made with him. His name was Brian. And I would follow up with him, ask him questions. I felt comfortable talking with him. He really did guide me in some ways in which I could better myself. But as a structural engineer, he would give me advice saying, you know, if you could solve this problem through Excel, you're in really good shape. And it was those type of advice that I was never given from any other person. And I really value that. And it was only through NSBE that I could set myself up. And it was honestly, from day one, he vouched for me and he always assisted me. And he said in any time that you need a reference, like, let me be that person for you. And it was these type of connection, trust that I could have with him that really made me value NSBE. And I feel that it helped me gain confidence being in this field, knowing that there isn't many other Black structural engineers at all. NSBE has also helped me with my well-being during the beginning of COVID, and especially in light of protests that occurred in June. This was like a community that I could speak to openly and share my thoughts, and we would all learn from one another and be there for each other. And being amongst this other group of Black engineers, I think that we really did find trust in each other, and we could talk about things politically and engineering related, and we were always trying to help each other get internship, research opportunity. And I believe it was through NSBE that I had obtained my research opportunity at the University of California, San Diego, as a R&D researcher with Dr. Beckler. And we were researching the study of wave propagation and like some like extraordinary material. So I think that NSBE really did help me, and I did come to the fortune that I found 3 years ago. And as current vice president, I'm really happy to say that I can help other people in this way as well. I think that we can increase diversity by exposing students to civil and structural engineering related internship, as Henry mentioned. I think that is very critical, and I was very fortunate to come across an internship this past summer, in which helped me figure out what direction I want to go into. And I think that the earlier that students obtain these internships for the sake of learning and not necessarily earning, it'll help them understand where they want to go in their path. And if they have someone that is very passionate about engineering, passionate about structural engineering, who's willing to lead the way, guide them, show them the ins and outs of what structural engineering is like, I feel that this will be a very, very big change and stepping stone for young engineers who want to be in this field or want to figure out which field is best for them. So that's all that I gained from NSBE, and hopefully I continue inspiring more students for years to come.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's fabulous, fabulous advice, and hopefully we can get SEAOC and NSBE a little bit closer in the coming years. Gwen, you mentioned in your intro that you were willing to share a few more details and some questions and answers. So I'd like to ask you, what was it like for you to come out as transgender, and maybe more importantly, how did your company and your clients receive the news?
So it was terrifying. You know, I had been a white male, kind of top of the pyramid, you know, hierarchy for 18 years, plus 6 years of education, right? And I'm a consulting engineer, consulting structural engineer. So my success at the company depends in large part on the projects I bring in. And so I depend on my clients essentially for my job security. So coming out as transgender, even in the Bay Area, was not an easy decision by any stretch. I mean, I stayed closeted for 18 years of my career because I was pretty sure that being transgender was incompatible with being a structural engineer. Like, it doesn't work. I couldn't get jobs or whatever. My company was actually very good. Lots of support from my company. My clients, I actually was fired from 3 jobs in 2012 for coming out as transgender, one of which I had worked on for 2 years and was probably the most qualified to finish that project. It was litigation, but my client didn't want to put me in front of a jury because I'm transgender. Now, since that time, I do expert witness stuff on occasion, and it hasn't been a problem. Attorneys have tried to use it against me, and it tends to lead to some backlash. But at the time, it was terrifying. It was a terrifying experience. It turned out okay, but it was terrifying at the time.
Thank you, Gwen. Henry, I'd like to come back to you. You gave us a few quick ideas about increasing diversity in our profession, but what does success look like in achieving diversity? And maybe more importantly, what metrics might we use to measure that?
Yeah, so Ali touched on it earlier, right? One metric you can use is to try to get the profession to at least slightly resemble the makeup of the country. And if you bear with me while I have a little bit of tunnel vision again with respect to the lack of Black engineers, you know, one possibility is maybe we start with that 4% as an initial target that is sort of representative at least of other aspects of structural engineering, so that it doesn't seem like an insurmountable task. But regardless of what sort of threshold we see we use as sort of that metric or that initial metric, we should keep in mind that there's a tipping point. And by that, I mean, there's a certain level of representation within any group where once the percentage gets above that tipping point, you start seeing collective advocacy. So to bring it back to our profession, one marker of at least initial success is seeing a critical mass of structural engineers beginning to consistently raise issues that are specific to the Black community. These days, we're all talking about infrastructure resilience, but what does that look like within the Black community? Are there issues of racial inequity when it comes to being a part of this conversation or having access to the resources and the programs that are intended to build resilience? I believe that once the numbers reach above that tipping point, you will start to see a collective effort among Black engineers and others to raise these issues.
Thank you, Henry. Thuy, I'd like to come back to you and ask you, can you share any thoughts on how your ethnicity or race or gender affected your career at any stage?
Yeah, so, I remember taking a wood class at Cal Poly, and my male classmate and I, we studied so hard for it. And so we compared notes because I couldn't understand why, what I did wrong on the test, and just try to learn from that. And we started noticing that I was getting more points knocked off for the same mistake he would make. And so I went to confront the professor, and he couldn't give me an answer that made sense. But instead, he told me that I shouldn't pursue structural engineering because I wouldn't make a good engineer. Had I listened to that instructor, I wouldn't be here today. And I later found out that he was very biased towards other female students, and they had reported their grievances to the career counselor, but not much was done about it. But so I'm glad that I didn't follow that advice. Most of my career, it was pretty supportive, but I have to say that once I became a mother, and being a young engineer and a young mother, that's where I really felt my career track tapered off. The opportunity for growth became limited. I felt like I have to prove more than my other peers that I was still a valuable team member and a good engineer. I was asked to show my commitment and my value to the firm by performing overhead tasks. Now, I understand that most traditional firm requires their engineers to perform overhead tasks as part of their job responsibility. But in this context, as a young mother and an engineer, it felt like an unfair burden at the time. And I thought that, coming back to work and maintaining my performance should have been good enough. But so I felt a lack of support, which led me to be very discouraged, and at one point thinking about leaving the industry. But instead, I started my own firm. I just want to ask that firm leaders out there, think about how you're going to support your young parents. And I say young parents because, this generation, there's both side of the parents, male, female, mom and dad, they both take part in raising the child. So how is it that the firm can support them when they're going through this critical transition of their life, but at the same time, their career track is should be moving upward? So think about, every firm's going to be different. So think about how you can support them so that we can retain the talent that we have and people don't get discouraged and leave the industry.
Thank you, Thuy. Ruben, I'm going to come back to you. It's been a while since we've had a chance to hear from you. I'd like to ask you, how have you faced questions or made decisions that have potentially placed your values against your professional goals?
It was a little bit over 20 years ago. I remember that I was coming off the design of a project that I was working on. This is when I was, just a graduate engineer in the firm where I was. The project was in construction, so my manager at the time brought me into his office, and he wanted to talk about what's next, what's my next assignment. And he presented two options, and he prefaced each project not with the discussion of the project itself. It was about the individual I was going to work with. And he started off with this senior project manager, dear friend of his, that he was absolutely effusive in his praise of what a great person, what a great engineer, what a great manager that individual was, and how much I would learn from him. The problem was that when he described the project, he said it was the Harris County Jail. Harris County is where Houston is. The next option he presented was to work with a senior principal that I didn't know much at the firm. and it was another local but high-profile sports project. You know, in retrospect, I'm sure my boss said some nice things about the senior principal. I think that at that time when I was at Walter P. Moore, a lot of my peers would have loved to have worked on a high-profile retractable roof stadia project. But I didn't choose, I ultimately chose the second. I didn't choose it because it's high profile or sports or anything like that. I chose it because it wasn't a jail. Again, where I grew up, with my upbringing, I've always had a problem with the American criminal justice system and how it seems to target African Americans and people of color. In my neighborhood, the only new developments I remember growing up were not, you know, fancy new retail, no housing, no, don't even mention new schools at the time. It was the expansion of Cook County Jail, which was within a mile from my house. There was also a relatively new juvenile detention center that whenever I got a ride from my sister to school, we passed by it all the time. So these are the only shiny new things that I would see growing up. So I was not going to work on the jail. You know, my apologies to that senior project manager. I can't say that in retrospect, I have had the pleasure of working with that individual many times on different types of projects, just not on that one. So when I was in that position, those are the kind of choices I could make. But now as the owner of a firm, I get to make more decisions. And my employees know that we're not going to work on jails. Being Hispanic in 2017, when the RFQs for the wall along the border here in Texas came out, I told my partners at Walter P. Moore, don't ask me to partner with you on this. We're not gonna work on anything related to that, period. You know, it was, I recently read a very well composed letter from Raphael in his president's message to SEAOC. And he raised the point about the choices we get to make in our profession, and it struck a chord with me. These are just some examples. I can't say that a lot of the work, a lot of the projects that we do, that we chase, are higher education. And I love the fact that we focus on a market that seeks to educate and train people. I love hearing stories of how these schools are trying to grow and in their mission to educate first generation students like myself and my family. I even highlighted that very fact in a successful response to an RFQ with the University of Texas in Austin. So yeah, I think it's important that we do what we can, and we're faced with decisions, and if they go against your values, whatever power you can to make decisions in accordance with your values, you should.
Thank you, Ruben. I'd like to take this opportunity to get our audience participation back and ask you guys another poll. We first talked about your current diversity in your office, and in the second poll, again, on a scale of 1 to 10, we're interested in how much the owners of your company or firm care about diversity, 1 being it's not very important, and 10 being it's very important. And I'll let this stay open for a few seconds here to get feedback from our entire audience. And again, I'll remind you, these results are anonymous. Okay, looks like we're stabilizing here. I'll go ahead and end the polling and share the results with you. It looks like that our firms, generally speaking, do care about diversity. I think this would have been a really interesting data point to have taken a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but it is a great snapshot in time, and hopefully this positive feedback means that we have an audience that's willing to affect change. That being said, I'm going to move into another round of Q&A with our panelists. And I'd like to go back to you, Gwen. I'd like to ask you about some of your fears or concerns you had before coming out as transgender. And you had mentioned before, but at the time, how long had you been at your firm before you shared your gender identity? And did you experience any distance or backlash from your colleagues as a result of your openness?
Yeah, so coming out was a long process. I started with a few friends in the office. They had to be really close, right? I was trusting them with basically what I thought might be a career-ending secret, right? So that was very scary. But I trusted those individuals with that secret. And then I had to go to corporate, which is in near Chicago. And I had to come up with excuses to talk to people. Like, I'm coming to corporate for no reason that I can tell you over the phone, but I'd like to talk to you at this in this time frame, this, from 12 to 1. Or I ended up coming out to, I think, 13 people in one day at corporate, and I basically asked for their support, and I got it. Partly that's a result of my privilege of having worked for the company for so long. Like, if I had been earlier in the like the 90s when I started, and they didn't know who I was, it would have been more difficult, I think, both culturally, because the country has progressed substantially since the 90s, but also just because they didn't know me. I didn't have a track record with them. And then, so I got their support, but then I also had to juggle the legal name change, changing my license name, all those things. And then I had to come out to the office. And so I got my court hearing to change my name and gender. And then a few days later, I came out to the office and we had a big pizza party. No one knew I think at that time I had 10 people in the office out of about 40 who knew. And so I viewed them as sort of my control rods to tamp down if anything got uncomfortable, but it was fine. I got lots of hugs and as soon as I got out of that was like an hour and a half where I basically talked and answered questions. I had 40 emails set to go to other people in the company who I had worked with over the years in other offices. So I hit send on 40 different emails with a letter attached explaining what was happening, and I was going to transition, and asking for their support. Almost overwhelmingly, everyone was very, very supportive. I can think of maybe one or two people who never talked to me again. But in a company of hundreds of people, that's not bad. But I mean, even the next day, my phone name and my mailbox name had been changed, to reflect my current name. And it was, people made a conscious effort to use the right pronouns and use the right name. And it's tough, if you've known someone for 18 years, to use the right name, to use the right pronoun after this switch. But it was really good, shockingly good.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Wisjani, for such a positive response. I'd like to go back to Thuy and ask you, Thuy, if you've experienced any discrimination, harassment, or microaggressions, or maybe even just the subject of unconscious bias by clients or managers, peers, or other consultants.
Yes, thank you. Well, I've experienced all of it in various degrees, but there's one particular conversation I remember having with a client, trying so hard to tell me that someone like me wouldn't be able to handle a demand of a large corporate client, and that they're used to dealing with more traditional, typical engineers. He named a couple of the larger SE firm and their engineers, which were all white male, and he asked me, do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? Yes, I understood clearly what he was trying to say. On another occasion, a project manager for a client was just asking me over and over on an engineering design concept, and about he asked about 5 different ways, and really just the same question, and receiving a consistent response from me. He made this microaggression comment. I guess you're not as easy to persuade as you look. I've been told I'm not a typical Asian woman. I can probably interpret that in many different forms, but probably I would say that, they're thinking that, oh, she's not passive, like most other Asian women that are perceived out there. So, as a female business owner, one thing that I feel that we face a lot is the interaction that we have to have with client and staff, with that unconscious bias, where our assertiveness and directness are seen as aggressive behavior, right? Like, I might be seen as a bitchy boss, but while our male colleagues who exhibit similar behavior are considered confident and knowledgeable. So even within our firm, my husband and I work together, and we would perform hiring interviews. And the minute we walk in, the candidate automatically assume he's the owner, he's the engineer. And even after we introduce ourselves, they still direct questions to him. So it's there, it's still there. Is it as frequent as it used to be? It's not, but definitely, all that experience. And I feel that one of the ways to mitigate it, and overcome these issues is, knowing who you are and representing yourself authentically. Really just being consistent and standing your ground, especially if you know you're right. And I know it's easier said than done, because I'm a people pleaser. So I really have to work hard on overcoming my initial instinct to please a client or please a contractor, But at the same time, it's important that our community see color. You hear people keep saying, "Oh, I'm colorblind." Well, no, we're all people of color. So see us for who we are and embrace the differences that we have. We have to embrace the differences in order to make a difference, to make an impact on what we are talking about here.
Thank you, Thuy. Ruben, I'd like to ask you, you spoke a little bit about your upbringing. At any time in your education or even in your career, did anyone ever express doubts in your ability to succeed because of your race or ethnicity?
I'm glad to report that I don't feel as though that it's been the case, and that I have to acknowledge that my first job was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, of all places, and my project manager at the time was he was also from the south side of Chicago, Lithuanian American, who was progressively minded. In retrospect, that's what I feel was the case. So nothing but encouraging, nothing but positive. I then joined Walter P. Moore in the summer of 1997, and my boss was a Nicaraguan. So we hit it off. He was a true mentor. I learned so much from him. So it's always been encouragement. It's always been, I'm glad to say, I've felt nothing but positivity. So I don't think anybody's doubted me because of my race.
Fabulous. Thanks, Ruben. And I'd like to remind the audience that we are nearing the time for open Q&A, and I do see some great questions coming in, but please think about any questions you'd like our panelists to address and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to go to Mohammed and ask you, in your opinion, how can we increase diversity in our profession?
That's a really good question. I think that we can increase diversity in our profession by offering students internship opportunity to get their foot in the door in this profession. I see oftentimes that corporate sponsors for NSBE, for example, would like to offer mentorship. And while that is great, and we do appreciate it, it is not going to necessarily have your it's not going to translate representation within your company. It's going to say, we did something externally and we're proud of that, but internally, it's still the same group of people, and it's not necessarily having, for example, me or my colleagues in NSBE working alongside you and changing the demographic in that company. So I feel that it is really necessary to take that extra step after mentorship and go with, you know, the final plan execution of hiring students of color to be in your company and value them as much as you value them while mentoring them. I think that this goes not only for Black students, but all students of color who are underrepresented as well. I feel that in structural engineering, though, Black students are very underrepresented, and I have yet to find a Black student from my structural engineering program working at a structural engineering company. I personally am in a mentorship group, which is really amazing. I would just like to see that they believe in me enough to have me in their company and working with them and making a change in that way as well. So I feel that that is one way we can go about increasing diversity in the field. But I'm sure there are many other ways to increase diversity as well.
Thanks, Mohammed. Henry, I'd like to come back to you. I've heard the phrase rising tides lift all boats, and I wondered if you think that's true when it comes to diversity.
Yeah, well, in my opinion, the answer is no. And I think Mohammed just touched on it. And especially when it comes to the Black community, our efforts must be targeted. Here's an example of a targeted effort. Mohammed mentioned he's in a leadership position in the UCSC chapter of NSBE, right? So for a little bit more context, this is an organization that has a membership of close to 20,000 students and professionals, right? Every year, they hold a national convention that attracts anywhere from 10 to 15,000 students or professionals, Black students or professionals. I can guarantee you that most major engineering employers in the US make it a priority to have representatives from their firm at an NSBE conference. On the other hand, I suspect most structural engineering firms are either unaware of the existence of such a conference or they don't see any value in attending. If we're gonna increase the number of Black structural engineers in the US, that is gonna have to change.
Thanks, Henry. Before we go to our open Q&A, I have a couple questions that I'm going to pose to multiple panelists. So this first one, I'm going to first hand to Gwen and then to Mohammed. And this actually came up in one of our audience questions already, but some people feel that personal information, be it sexual orientation, gender identity, or religious views, should be kept private and separate from our work environment. I'd like to ask you to please explain the potential impacts or consequences of this viewpoint, and how might we be respectful of each other's sharing or receiving of information without offending each other? So Gwen, you can start us.
Yeah, so, I mean, some things can be hidden, right? I mean, race cannot be hidden. Gender identity really can't be hidden unless you remain in the closet. So if it's a request to remain in the closet, the answer should be no. But other things can be hidden. Sexual orientation, for one, but it's draining to hide it, just like it was draining to hide being transgender. You know, if you come into the office and everyone's talking about what they did over the weekend with their significant other, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, and you can't mention that you have a girlfriend, that's draining, right? You try to work around it. And so, you know, in addition to being trans, I'm a lesbian, and my girlfriend lives in Chicago. So I've had instances where a client's discussing, the weekend or whatever, and I say, oh, I went to Chicago, and then they ask, oh, was that for business? And it's sometimes difficult to answer that, even in the Bay Area, because I don't know how that client will react. I mean, they probably are pretty clear that I'm trans, and they seem to be okay with that, but I just don't know how they will react if I tell them, oh, I was visiting my girlfriend in Chicago. And sometimes I'm sufficiently unsure that I dance around it. I say I was visiting a friend, or I did some work in Chicago. But that's called covering. It means you're dancing around it. You're avoiding it. You're lying by omission, and it's extremely draining, and it's damaging long term. And I think to sum up, it's basically like the people who are offended by that need to suck it up. They have the privilege of being heterosexual or being of the religion that everyone else mostly is. And they just have to recognize there's a privilege associated with that. You get to talk about those things, and your coworkers may not. I think that's my takeaway.
Thanks, Gwen. And Mohammed, I'll hand the same question to you.
Yeah, I think personal aspect of myself is hard to keep hidden in work, school, and other public places of my life. For example, my religion. My name is Mohammed, so I'm a Muslim, right? And I find myself oftentimes like in certain predicaments, which I have to choose. I don't have a clear-cut solution to like a immediate question that I'm in. For example, one of my major concerns interning this past summer was finding out when and where is it appropriate for me to pray, do my daily prayers while at work. As a Muslim, I have 5 daily prayers that I'm obligated to complete, and they are at specified times. And while I'm working, interning this past summer, I find myself very busy. Instead of looking at my clock, what time am I going to pray? I have paper documents that I need to complete, and I'm on the go. And I guess it's really important that in this profession, and honestly any profession, to make aware of other people's personal commitment, no matter the time and place. I think that in this profession, especially, you should really be, as a company, I feel like you're investing in the individual. You want to see their diversity, you want to see what their life is like, all the while they're performing their work and excelling. If those two don't interfere with each other, it should be okay, and there shouldn't be much conflict. Another example is fasting. During the holy month of Ramadan, we're obligated to fast from sunrise to sunset. And that means like no eating. And I know some of you are thinking like, oh, does that mean you could drink water? No water either. So my performance while working, being at school, may decrease just because of the sheer amount of fuel I have for the day. And while I am going about my day, some students, I remember asking me, hey, do you want to grab lunch? I would either have 2 answers, and it would genuinely depend on how I'm feeling at the moment, which answer I would give. First answer would be, no, thank you. I'm fasting. This is the holy month of Ramadan. And it would be short, sweet, and simple, and would part ways. Other answer would be saying, no, thanks. I had a meal earlier, and I'm full. I'm good. And they would ask, oh, when did you eat? Like, it's still like you've been in class all day. We've been together all day. And it would be that at that point where I would explain myself and go that extra 10 minutes, knowing that I have a lot of things to accomplish within that next hour. Explain myself, what am I doing this for? What is the religion like? And it's kind of like doing this with multiple different people, multiple occasions. And as Gwen has said, it's draining. I don't have that capacity to go out of my way every day to explain myself. I would just like it to be that if everyone is so open and willing to accept my religion and understand on their own research basis, I think that that's one thing. Educating them yourself is really important, so that when you come across this person, you say, "Oh, hey, I see that you're a Muslim. I understand what you're going through right now. We'll catch up later after you eat at night." So I think that it's those type of thoughts that really do count, and it will make a difference in how employers will value their employees at work, I feel.
Thanks, Mohammed. I'm going to do one more question, and this one's going to go to Ruben and Thuy. We'll go Ruben first. Do you believe the profession of structural engineering is diverse?
Nope, not at all. Just very quickly, in my own firm, we're 23 people. Maybe it's better than others, but it's half the firm, 11 people are white. We have a decent representation of South Asians, including my wife, who's Pakistani. But no, I don't think so. We used to have more women. We were about 40% women at our peak. We're probably closer to 25 right now. So I'll have to admit, in my own place, no.
Thanks, Ruben. Thuy?
No, I think there's progress that's been made, but definitely not, especially at the leadership level. And we need, this is important. Diversity is important because what we're seeing is our clients are demanding it. They've been very supportive of our business, and some of our clients are restructuring some of their contracting to require some of these diversity, equity, inclusion. So I would love to see more of it. I'm proud to say that our team is diverse, but we have a team of 9. I like to see more firm like that. So we have some work to do.
Thank you, Thuy. I'm going to go ahead and now start feeding our panelists some questions that have come in throughout the presentation today. And the first one is to Mohammed. Back to you. Can you share a little bit about NSBE's current initiatives to increase diversity and improve inclusivity in universities and colleges?
Yeah, absolutely. Currently, NSBE's mission as a national organization is to increase the number of culturally responsible Black engineers that excel professionally, succeed academically, and thus positively impacting the community. So internally within the NSBE UCSD organization, we have initiatives in which we collaborate with other diversity organizations, such as the Society of Women Engineers and the Society of Hispanic Engineers, to name a few. Our board members also attend workshops that highlight how to be an inclusive leader and learning how to branch out and work with other individuals of different backgrounds. NSBE at UCSD also do outreach events that we offer tutoring to middle school, high school students, and it is to increase our representation to other younger students who may not know that there are Black engineers who are in college and pursuing these type of fields and who are in these professions. NSBE, we as an organization aim towards getting students direct access to internships and research opportunities from corporate sponsors. I think that's a big one that we're working on getting set in stone. And I believe that it's really important for us to make that move happen because it will translate to representation in the profession and in industry.
Thank you, Mohammed. Our next question comes to us from New Zealand. How do we avoid tokenism and asking individuals to represent their entire demographic? And I know, Gwen, you said you'd take a first pass at it, and this is open to all of our panelists. Gwen, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. It's a concern. We don't want to hire someone just because they're a person of color or because they're a minority. I mean, studies have shown that firms that are more diverse do better. And I think it's a toss-up as to whether it's because it's a diverse firm or because the firm is already open to people who are different. But, you know, our clients, we want our company to look like our clients. I think that's what it comes down to. We want our company to look like society. So, but it's a concern that, you know, we don't want to appear that we're hiring people just because they are a person of color or a certain minority. So it's a fine line, I think. Henry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I have a slightly different view on it. So you know, being the only or one of two Black people in academic and professional spaces pretty much my entire career, you know, to me it's this idea of, you know, you're the only one and you're expected to represent your entire whatever group you're part of. But it's a tricky issue because one, I think you have to start somewhere in terms of hiring people. But also I think, and I'm glad the question was raised, I think after, you know, mentioning that this is actually a thing, right? People feel isolated when they're expected to answer a lot of questions about whatever group they're answering. That puts a lot of pressure on them. I think speaking up about that and so that sort of the broader society knows that this is an issue, to me is really the way to address this particular thing. But as Gwen said, you know, nobody expects anyone to hire someone just because they're a part of a particular group. And you know, I'm often offended when, you know, that's even part of the conversation, right? So when we're hiring, it's sort of a baseline benchmark that you're going to hire someone who you think is going to perform well, right? That's understood. So I don't even think that even needs to be part of the conversation when it talks about hiring people of color and underrepresented minorities. The problem is because some of these groups have been excluded from these professions for so long, it takes a little bit more effort to find, you know, the best and the brightest. That's what it is. It's not that they're there, but because they've been excluded for so long, sometimes they don't even know this thing exists, or sometimes they don't even know the beauty of this profession, right? So it takes, as I said before, taking one or two steps towards this particular group to sort of start that process of finding those individuals.
Thanks, Henry. I'm gonna go to our next question, and it's a little long, but I think important for me to read it in its entirety. It says, "It hurt when my company was silent on Black Lives Matter. When I casually brought it up to management to say that this was a hard time, I was told that indeed it was impacting a few of our downtown projects. There are good people at my company, but they probably don't even know how to talk about race. How do I open up the discussion to help create a more inclusive, empathetic work environment? As a Black woman, I don't feel seen and I don't feel supported." So I'm going to hand this question first to Ruben and then Mohammed to follow up.
I think it's excellent, an excellent question to pose because a lot of us were faced with this. I can say that personally, as I alluded to earlier in my discussion, in the middle of all that, in the middle of summer, I at one point reached out to those friends of mine and I just said, I feel for you. I'm sorry for me to say this as a guy, but that I love you guys. I initiated a discussion with them first, and I composed something that I published on behalf of my firm and posted it on social media for Martinez Moore Engineers. I'm not angling for retweets or likes or anything like that. I had to do it. It's what I needed to do. Silence is violence. So I can understand the struggle if the leadership at your firms don't support this, but not everybody's like this. I know that there are people that are honestly struggling with it. I don't think it's that hard. It shouldn't be that hard, but perhaps we need to acknowledge a little bit that it's hard and help people to deal with that. It's the right thing to do. So maybe speak out on your own. I did reach out to my employees and ask them to, if you want to talk, let's talk. And I've had various discussions with people in my firm. So I think that's been a positive outcome.
Yeah, I can touch base on that as well. I know that while I was interning, the discussion did come up for me as well. Being in a room full of non-Black people, they were, a bit interested on like how I feel, what are my thoughts. And, I told them what my thoughts were, but I didn't want that to be the daily conversation, because that is going to remind me of all the tragic things that happened this past year with police brutality. And it's very emotionally draining for me as an individual personally. I think that it is important though to open up and let your management know how you feel, how it's bothering you, and how it may be performing your work. If it is, how it is impacting your work, if it is, impacting your work at all. I think that it's important to have some type of, as a college student, we call it office hours, some type of office hours where you can, talk about what is bothering you during the week and how you think that you could do better if something was changed. And if management isn't listening, then, it kind of questions the ethics that they have going on. Or if they are good people, let them know, hey, I think that this discussion is gonna bring less tension for me and you if we talk it out, and how it's bothering me. And the fact that you're not bringing it up, I think Ruben said it. He said, silence is violence. It's kind of bringing like another hidden agenda that, you might be unconscious of, the people you may be working around. So I think that opening up, talking about what's bothering you, and seeing how management can assist you would be, I think, the best way to go about making your work environment empathetic.
Emily, can I just say one quick thing on that? So obviously really great points by Ruben and Mohammed, and I do agree with Mohammed that we should be talking about this stuff, but we can't deny the fact that your position of power in whatever organization you are is going to influence whether you can and will speak up, right? I recently transitioned from being an assistant professor to an associate professor, where having tenure gives you a certain level of job security, right? So figuratively speaking, the gloves can sort of come off. So when we say yes, it's speaking up is good. It's not always possible, and I recognize that sometimes speaking up has consequences.
Thanks, Henry. I'm going to go to Thuy for our next audience question. It says, how do we advocate for underrepresented people of color, women, and LGBTQ people in our offices now?
I want to follow up with what everyone had said here, but one thing that Henry just said is about, depending on your position, speaking up could have implications. So I believe that, at least for myself, I believe that it starts at the leadership level. I can say that for myself, it took a lot of courage, and I think that's what's needed, is to have the courage to even participate in this type of discussion to begin with, instead of staying silent, right? I was hesitant when I see these forums, but I told myself that if I'm here to make a difference, if I'm here and I'm concerned, what am I going to do about it? So I believe that courage is one thing, and it starts at the leadership level to talk about it. I know I had a hard time bringing these difficult conversation up with my small team. So I can imagine that in a larger setting, it could be intimidating because you may not know what to say, but you have to start somewhere. So I did that. I opened up the conversation to the team, and I welcomed them to talk to me individually. And I do understand that sometimes with a small firm, resources and capacity could be an issue. You know, people are there's so much work to be done, and sometimes people just think, well, I don't have time to deal with this, talk about this. But as a firm leader, you have to prioritize, right? So we started having our weekly DEI discussion recently, because I drum up the courage to have the conversation. So I believe that part of this conversation and the advocacy have to start at the leadership level. And from there, that will lend to conversation. So firm leader, if you haven't done so, take the courage to talk to your staff. Maybe you can start with a small setting and go from there, but take action. You know, take action to advocate. And it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to say, hey, I don't know how to start this conversation, but it's an important conversation to have, and be open. So that's just my thought from, you know, my own experience, bringing this up to my team and what we're doing about it now.
Thanks, Thuy. Henry, did you want to add to that?
No, actually, I was putting my hands up because of another question that came through.
Okay.
If you don't mind. So somebody mentioned, you know, if a company only hires graduates from certain structural engineering program at certain schools, it might be the case where the structural engineering program lacks diversity. How should we resolve that issue? And so, you know, as an academic, for obvious reasons, that's something that I can speak to. So I'd say a couple of things. One, you know, this type of conversation is happening at universities as well. It's also happening at UCLA. I think the great thing is that at least at UCLA, it's being led by the students, right? So the students are speaking up about the lack of diversity, and they're sort of sounding the horn. So I think that's a really good thing. So that's one. Yes, you're right. Certain programs, especially at the top institutions, there is a lack of diversity, and those conversations are being had. But the other issue is sort of what the question alluded to, which is, and again, I'm going to go back to Black engineers. You know, if the only Black engineers you're seeing are from Stanford or Berkeley or UCSD, you know, that's a problem, because in the broader society, you know, everybody gets a shot, right? That's not the only place where you find structural engineers. So I think it's partly on the companies to sort of diversify where they're actually looking to find structural engineers.
Thanks, Henry. I'm going to ask a question here, and I'm going to hand it to Gwen. It came from one of our audience members. How would you recommend that a firm that lacks diversity in the senior level staff to improve inclusivity in leadership group, both in the short term and in the long term?
So our company has a series of goals that get updated every 5 years. And for the first time, we are adding diversity as one of the goals. And we have put younger people in charge of that committee, or a large number of. The committee is a majority of younger people. I think also opening up, maybe have a position on your board of directors for one of your younger engineers who is more likely to be a minority than the hierarchy of white males who are up there right now. Those are all potential options. It's not an easy task, but the first step is to acknowledge the problem and then start to work towards it, towards a solution.
Thanks, Gwen. We are nearing the end of our time here today, and I'd like to acknowledge there's a few questions in the chat about pipeline issues, and is SEAOC doing anything to increase outreach efforts? And to that end, I'll say our DEI committee is discussing a whole bunch of initiatives right now, and I would like to launch a final poll to get your input to help us drive the future direction and strategy of SEAOC. So I'd like to ask you all, and you have the opportunity to choose multiple answers. What DEI initiatives should SEAOC prioritize? Education like this for our members, scholarships for underrepresented demographics, mentoring and advocacy at the K-12, mentoring and advocacy within collegiate levels, surveying and data collection, or assisting firms with implementing DEI strategies. And I'm going to leave this one open for a little bit here because this will be really important feedback for our SEAOC board and our SEAOC DEI committee to move forward from here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, and I'll go ahead and share the results with you guys. It looks like we should be doing all of it, but this is really great feedback. I would like to thank the audience for your thoughtful questions, and specifically to our panelists for your meaningful contributions. We've reached the end of our discussion. However, I'd like to reinforce it's really the beginning of our commitment to real change. With that, I'd like to hand off to SEAOC past president, Raphael Sabelli, for some concluding thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Emily. Excellent, excellent session. Excellent job moderating it. I'd also like to thank the panelists and the audience for very active participation. I'm very glad we did this. As Ali said, diversity, equity, and inclusion are vital to our profession. And as Emily pointed out, our DEI committee realizes the importance of listening to our members. So we're going to continue to listen and welcome observations, comments, and other input at SEAOC@SEAOC.org. You might add DEI in the subject line, but I think we'll get the point. One of the reasons for doing this session was to identify issues, veins for us to tap in our DEI committee, and I'd like to just summarize a few of the things that we heard. And that we'll be taking to the DEI committee and hopefully turning into action. First of all, we need diversity. People need to see themselves not only welcomed, but represented. The good news is people feel their firms care about diversity, but we need more data. We need to have our diversity or lack of diversity quantified to assess status and progress. The informal poll showed that diversity in our workplaces on a scale of 1950 to 2020 is about 1965. So we've got some work to do. It's time for change. Critical mass is an achievable target, and maybe that's where we should be focusing. Our outreach efforts do not need to be limited to people who are already committed to structural engineering, but we can use it to attract people to structural engineering. Mentorship does not have as strong an impact as internship, and that level of commitment is really what's called for. There's a social dimension to our projects that we need to consider. It may not be possible for a well-engineered private prison to be a success using proper criteria. We should be embracing differences. I don't see color is at best unhelpful. We should embrace diversity, recognizing that not being able to take acceptance for granted is isolating, unfair, potentially restrictive. Being forced to conform is draining and unfair, and forcing conformity serves no purpose, certainly not operational efficiency. Visibility is important. We all know someone who is not a white male, someone who is gay, trans, Muslim, atheist, whatever. Silence is violence. And we all need to avail ourselves of readily available resources to understand the concerns of our fellow human beings. So once again, I would like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank Emily, our moderator, and I would like to thank you, the audience. So with that, we're going to conclude our session, and I'll remind people that the SEAOC convention keynote begins at 9:30. Thank you.